Taking you live now to an all-day forum on Israel's influence on the U.S. This is hosted by a group called American Education Trust and Institute for Research. This is just getting underway.
Your phones are silenced and quiet so as not disrupt the proceedings. We also ask that if anyone would like to have conversations that you take it outside, or better yet to the exhibition hall, which was right by registration. There is a book signing scheduled today for our speakers that have books. The book signing schedule can be found in your program, and the signings will happen again in the exhibition hall. You'll see a big sign that says book signing over there. Q&A today will be done on note cards. The bags you received at check-in, there should be 5 note cards and a pen in there. You can use those pens, use those note cards to write questions as the panelists are speaking. Someone will be going around, or multiple people will be going around to collect the note cards and hand them to the moderator, who will then shuffle through them to ask the questions to the speakers. It allows us to keep things fast and stay on schedule. On the back of your badge that you received, there should be a little red ticket. Just make sure you hold on to that. That will be needed for the reception that begins at 5 o'clock after the program. Just a reminder, too, that there is no recording inside of here unless you have received prior approval. Also, today's program is being streamed live on C-SPAN and online on various sources. So to our online audience, you can submit questions at Israel Influence on Twitter, or email conference@wrmea.org, and we'll make sure your questions get passed on to the audience. And finally, we just want to give a big thank you to all of our donors that helped make today's event possible, because it would not have happened without them. And with that being said, I'm going to introduce Grant Smith, who will be moderating and beginning our first panel. Grant is the director of the Institute for Research, Middle Eastern Policy, a wonderful organization that is, again, co-sponsoring this event today. He's the author of a brand new book, which I think is publicly launching today. Is that correct?
Correct.
It's called Big Israel: How Israel's Lobby Moves America. It's his 8th book on the Israel lobby. Grant is every day very hard at work doing FOIA requests with the CIA, Department of Defense, to uncover all sorts of stuff that no one else is. So with that being said, I will hand it over to Grant.
Thank you, Dale. I'm going to be drawing some interesting facts from that book launching today, Big Israel, and really structuring it into 10 ways that the lobby moves America. Now, I'd like to start off with some figures from a poll that was conducted last week in 4 countries. Statistically significant Google consumer research asking a fundamental question vital for understanding the current situation in the Middle East. And that question was, which of the following do you believe to be true? A, Israelis occupy Palestinian land. B, Palestinians occupy Israeli land. As far as I know, no one's ever asked this question to a statistically significant audience in 4 countries. Our friends across the pond, the Great Brits, 62% of them believe that the Israelis occupy Palestinian land. If you go up to Canada, a majority of that population, 51%, believe that Israelis occupy Palestinian land. If you go down to Mexico and ask, ¿Cuál de las siguientes crees que sea cierto? You'll find that some 55% of Mexicans also believe, the majority, that Israelis occupy Palestinian land. There is only one country in North America that believes the opposite is true, with the majority of us, Americans, 49%, believing that, in fact, Palestinians are the ones doing the occupying. Now, why is it we're so out of sync with these other countries? What is it that we know or are told that they are not? I'd like to remind everybody of a statement that Prime Minister Benjamin Netanyahu made back in 2001 that was only really circulated in 2011. And that was that his perception was, as told to West Bank settlers, America is something you can move very easily. move it in the right direction. They won't get in our way. What was he talking about? What moves America? Why is it, as uncovered by Edward Snowden, that across federal agencies, perhaps unbeknownst to many Americans, that a policy doctrine, that the survival of the State of Israel is paramount, the paramount goal of Middle East policy? Well, I would say, many would say, more are saying it's because of the Israel lobby. Note that I'm not saying what was said in Valentino's Ghost, the Jewish lobby, because that's not what I'm talking about. I'm talking about Israel affinity organizations that are tax-exempt charities that have as a primary objective the advancement of Israel. Together, 336 of these, which are included in the Big Israel Study, which went through 4,000 tax returns and a great deal of internal documents obtained by FOIA, 336 of them make up what I'm calling the Israel lobby. Now, there are 5 false narratives about the Israel lobby that it promotes. Number one, that Americans who are Jewish are all Israel Affinity Organization members who support lobbying from these groups. False. Number two, Americans who are evangelical Christians are major forces in building this Israel Affinity infrastructure. False. Number three, Israel Affinity organizations are broad, diverse, with a great deal of member support. False. Number five, that Israel Affinity organizations are representative bodies. False. And number five, Americans who generally favor Israel, which is true generally, are also generally favorable toward massive foreign aid packages. False. Establishment news media generally helps amplify these claims and does generally a great job saying that the major organizations represent populations unequivocally. If you saw reports from the battle over the Iran nuclear deal, you saw announcements from the Anti-Defamation League, the American Israel Public Affairs Committee, the American Jewish Committee, the Conference of Presidents of major American Jewish organizations, all saying that they were opposed to the deal. So, Americans who were Jewish must have been against the deal as well, right? Wrong. In fact, American support generally was about 53%, whereas Jewish American support was at 59%. So if we look at the latest Pew Charitable Trust survey, you find that 82% of the Jewish population of this country does not belong to such organizations. They're only somewhat attached to Israel, 70%. Most have never traveled to Israel. 44% think settlement building is a bad idea. If you take that remaining 18%, multiply it by the adult Jewish population, it's about 774,000, or the population of Charlotte, North Carolina. And the lobby knows and talks about this internally, saying, you know what? Someday we're going to be challenged on these numbers and all of these broad claims. So who does the lobby really represent? Well, the views and concerns of mega donors, for sure, the views and concerns of a relatively small group of boards of directors and top officials, and of course the Israeli government, with which many are in direct and ongoing consultation. If we look at donor concentration and control of some of the top organizations, we find that within the Republican Jewish Coalition, some 143 donors give 76% of the funding. At AIPAC, 1,700 donors give 56% of the funding, with a top donor giving 13%. Casino mogul Sheldon Adelson donated $1 million to ZOA, the Zionist Organization of America. That was 20% of their 2013 funding. There's extreme donor concentration at many of these advocacy organizations within the Israel lobbying ecosystem, and governance, as reported in some parts of the press, is extremely unrepresentative. Despite bylaws, despite occasional voice votes, many Israel affinity organizations are authoritarian. The boards select their own members. They hold pro forma voice votes. And of course, Many of the CEOs have been around for a quarter century or more. If you look at Abraham Foxman at the ADL, he's been in place or was in place for 28 years. Daniel Pipes at the Middle East Forum, in place for 26 years. Mort Klein of the Zionist Organization of America, 23 years. Now, the average tenure of a corporate CEO is less than 10. A college president, less than 8. I would say that the rotation in governance kind of reflects the stagnation and lack of representation at many of these organizations. Now, another false concept is that Christian evangelicals are a major portion of building the Israel lobby in America. And yes, there are 80 million Christians who are evangelical. They've been courted by the lobby since the 1960s, almost constantly. Many of them, of course, do vote about their feelings for Israel in American elections. But when you peel back the layers, you see that organizations like Christians United for Israel receive their seed funding from large Israel lobby donors to install their fundraising software, Convio as it happens, to pay for massive public relations campaigns at Burson Marsteller as it happens, and that they're really not very big. $2 million at Kufi in 2007 revenue before it went dark under some IRS regulations, and then 2012 revenue at International Fellowships of Christians and Jews was $113 million. So there is a false idea that these are major forces in the Israel lobby. What we do know, though, is that Americans generally, if you ask them favorability ratings about Israel, they're generally favorable. Most are favorable, 59%, 41%, not favorable, don't care. We've given over $250 billion of aid to Israel, far more than any other country, inflation adjusted. And a large portion of aid is classified. President Obama made a statement at American University that it's now unprecedented, but you can't get the figure for intelligence aid. If it's unprecedented and we know it military aid, it's either $1.9 billion a year or $13.2 billion if the president adjusted for inflation. But when you ask the CIA, which must be handling intelligence aid to Israel, they say, sorry, that's classified. And we're suing them for that information, by the way. 2014 poll. When you ask Americans something beyond favorability, when you ask them about the aid and ask this question, the U.S. gives over $3 billion annually, or 9% of the foreign aid budget, more than any other country. This amount is question mark. Statistically significant 2014 survey conducted through Google Consumer Research. 60.7% say it's either much too much or too much. 25%, 25.9% say about right, 13.4% too little. Well, this is an old poll. Surely this is a fluke. You know, these many respondents must have given, I don't know, there must have been a fluke. Well, no. 2016 conducted again this month. The figure has risen to almost 62% who say it's too much or much too much. This is a specific question with information sufficient to make an informed answer, and the movement is generally against foreign aid. So these 5 false narratives that are used to move America should be challenged. Now I'd like to move on to 5 more about a variety of subjects. If we look at state and local governments, there's an absolute explosion in activities and lobbying on behalf of Israel. A great deal of this is taking place from Jewish community relations councils, which are inside large foundations. They're distributed across every major population center. They function under the old American Zionist Council model, in which, like AIPAC was back in the day, just a little committee inside a big organization. That's what they do. They lobby as unorganized, unincorporated committees. Well, that stopped for AIPAC back when the Kennedy administration told the AZC to register as a foreign agent. 6 weeks later, AIPAC broke off and finally incorporated. The community relations councils, however, lobby the way AIPAC used to lobby without disclosing very much, and some top AIPAC lobbyists are terrified, these slides will be online at the end of the day, by the way, terrified and quoted saying that he would sure hate to see any of this reported properly. So what we have in terms of the prerogative of the presidency to take away Iran sanctions, it's hard to unwind all of these state-level Iran boycotts. When we talk about the president maybe wanting to be in charge of whether law enforcement is trained in Israel, If we talk about changes to state pension funds to allow the purchase of more Israel bonds, that's not an executive prerogative anymore. In fact, California would love and pass a resolution saying that California believes Israel's borders should be determined by the government of Israel. State of California state legislature. This is a type of resolution you see passed in many state legislatures. But when you ask Americans, again, in a statistically significant poll, the following question, Congress and state legislatures pass scores of resolutions condemning Palestinians and voicing unconditional support for Israel every year. Do you support this or not? Almost 70% say, these resolutions don't represent my views. So this is not representative government. One of the JCRCs that does report, which is a big force in greater Washington, raises, for every dollar it raises, it extracts $1.58 in tax dollars for Israel. It's very active. It's building Israel Affinity Organization buildings on the taxpayer dime. It's doing all sorts of trade development and international studies and scientific endeavors on the state tax dollar with Israel. So there's a great deal of activity going on at the state level. Another thing that's very interesting is that Israel Affinity organizations, a few of them enjoy a high level of criminal immunity. And this has been going on since the 40s. The original organizations involved in conventional weapons smuggling to Jewish fighters in Palestine, there are only a handful of indictments. The Zionist Organization of America has received 7 foreign agent registration orders. There's never been any high-level criminal prosecutions over nuclear smuggling, which Dr. Mattson will be talking about. There's no high-level prosecution for espionage. There have been solid cases against AIPAC in 1985 and 2005, all shut down by the Justice Department. The ADL, holding classified information in the 90s, shut down by the Justice Department. United Against the Nuclear Iran was conducting a smear campaign against a Greek shipper. It held classified information. The Greek shipper sued. The Justice Department waded into the case and shut it down. The Justice Department is losing a great deal of credibility by never seeming to be able to uphold the law when it comes to espionage cases. Finally, number 8, Israel Affinity Organization activities inside executive, state, and federal agencies. We see a wave of political appointees who are becoming known for lobbying, advocating on behalf of Israel within federal agencies. Dennis Ross at Department of State, Neil Sher at the Justice Department, Josh Mandel, who bought $80 million of Israel bonds after changing state pension fund laws and lobbying to buy more for the Ohio State Treasury, neoconservatives at the Pentagon, which we are hoping Jim Loeb will cover later today, Stuart Levy and David S. Cohen at Treasury, conducting economic warfare against Iran, unaccountable to public inquiries, but always seemingly meeting at the Washington Institute for Near East Policy to give private briefings. The FBI ADL liaison, which I go into great depth in my book, which has been ongoing since the 1950s, and various IRS commissioners whose scorecard on creating more intransparency for Israel Affinity organizations or ignoring congressional requests to investigate various groups has been ongoing since the 1960s. And with this level of what I would call regulatory capture of some key agencies, you of course have abuse of tax-exempt status. Now, before many organizations became Israel lobbying organizations, they were, in fact, holding clear social welfare purposes: immigrant aid, life insurance, cultural and educational endeavors, charitable hospitals. So this first wave that started in the mid-1800s tended to reduce government burden, which is the actual reason that organizations are given tax-exempt status. But as we've moved on, and since 1948, many of the organizations are not really offsetting any government burden. They're creating more government burden, whether it's lobbying for increased kinetic action against Israel's enemies, which is that's how they talk, or the Israel Project, which functions as sort of a PR agency for the Israeli government and attempts to leverage that into being able to quash who appears on certain programs. So we've been moving away as the lobby grows into the largest, collectively the largest charitable entity in the United States. In 2012, it was about $3.672 billion. By the end of the decade, it will be at $6.2 billion. The tax burden that this creates directly means that Americans, just to offset the subsidy, will be paying about $1 billion extra in taxes by the end of the year. And when you look at it on a chart, foreign aid versus the revenue raised by these 336 organizations, our foreign aid to Israel, the unclassified, what we know about, looks like a big matching grants program, where as much money as these organizations can raise to lobby and spend and convince people to move Israel's way in the United States is not just simply matched by the federal government for the annual aid program, which will be a big topic, I'm sure, at AIPAC's convention next week. So, probably the most costly thing is the constant agitation for policies and military actions against Israel's enemies. And we can see this as well in the United States when we do consumer research surveys. Right before the final negotiations over the Iran nuclear program, 58% of Americans were so scared they were already convinced that Iran had nuclear weapons. That's how far we've been moved. And so, I would argue, in my book I argue, that America has been too easily moved, and that we're paying the transport bill, and that only through much greater awareness, and particularly focusing on many of these captured agencies, will we be able to stop this downward spiral. And now, I've got 4 seconds left. I would like to welcome Dr. Roger Madsen, who is going to do our next presentation. Now, Dr. Roger J. Madsen is the author of the recently published book, Stealing the Bomb: How Denial and Deception Armed Israel. We'll take questions in a bit, sir. Can we get a question card over to this guy with his hand up, or can he give you one? We'll be collecting those and bringing them up. Have a Q&A at the end. Dr. Roger Madsen has experience in engineering and management at Sandia National Laboratory, the Atomic Energy Commission, the Nuclear Regulatory Commission, the Environmental Protection Agency, and several other nuclear safety and security consultancies. He was advisor to the Nuclear Regulatory Commissioners on policy issues such as safety goals, risk assessment, nuclear standards, 3 Mile Island. And after leaving government service in 1984, he led 2 private companies that provided safety and security services for U.S. nuclear power plants, the Energy Department's nuclear facilities, and several foreign users of nuclear power. Following the Chernobyl incident in 1986, he helped develop IAEA guidance on safety principles for the world's nuclear power plants. He oversaw nuclear safety consultancies in 5 countries. He also served on the off-site safety committees for several nuclear power plants and several DOE nuclear facilities. In 2012, he was part of a team formed by the American Society of Mechanical Engineers to forge a new safety construct for nuclear power after the tragedy at Fukushima. He has participated in safety analyses and field surveys of nearly 150 nuclear facilities in the US, Europe, the former Soviet Union and the Far East, including the startup of the latest U.S. nuclear power plant in 2015. Roger?
Got the button. Let me just say a couple things at the start to get us rolling. This is a complex story that I'm going to tell you today. It's been ongoing for about 60 years, as you will learn, and it's come into the public light in kind of a random way. We learn a little bit here, we learn a little bit there. So it was hard for me to piece it together over the years, and I had assistance from Grant and some of his FOIA requests, and I'll show you some of those later. There's some science involved in this story, so if I'm trying not to go over your head on the science, but the science is important to the story. So if you have questions about that, send a card up and we'll see if we can answer it at the Q&A session. I'm going to cover a lot of territory. When I was in China helping them start their first nuclear regulatory authority, I learned a phrase about moving fast through a subject. They call it watching the flowers from horseback. So today we're going to watch some flowers from horseback, if you get my meaning. There's some new information in what I'm going to talk about that's never been talked about publicly before. It's in the book, and we'll point it out as we come to it. I started an interest in this subject, the theft of nuclear materials from the United States to jumpstart the Israeli nuclear weapons program, in 1977, when I was asked to lead a group of NRC, Nuclear Regulatory Commission, security experts to look at the charges by a whistleblower, one of our colleagues at the Nuclear Regulatory Commission. Over the years, as more information became available, I learned that I hadn't been told everything the government knew at the time it set me up to conduct that investigation, so I had a certain curiosity in it. There were a couple congressional investigations following the whistleblower activity, the most important of which was led by Mo Udall, a Democrat from Arizona, and his records became available in recent years at the University of Arizona Library, which were a vital source to me. We're going to hear in the story about a man named John Haddon, a CIA person. He was station chief for CIA in Tel Aviv at the time of this event. His son made his records available to me about 2 years ago after his father's death, and they proved invaluable, as you'll see from quotations I'll provide from there. And then in 2006, the Department of Energy declassified some technical information about the uranium that was stolen, and it helped put the whole story together. So some of this broke very late compared to when it happened. Let me say a couple things about Israel's nuclear program. The first reactor built in Israel was supplied by the United States under President Eisenhower's Atoms for Peace program. Some of you are probably old enough to remember that. It was an attempt by the Eisenhower administration to stay in the lead over the Soviets in the distribution of nuclear technology in the world. And a small research reactor was built at Nahal Sarek in Israel. About the same time, because the United States refused to provide a plutonium production reactor, the Israelis made a deal with the French that had its genesis in the Suez Canal crisis and the support that the Israelis provided for the French in that affair. And they obtained on the QT the design and fabrication of a reactor at a place called Dimona in Israel. The French provided not only the reactor and the fuel, but also the reprocessing plant from which plutonium could be extracted for making nuclear weapons. An important part of the Israeli program was an organization called LACM, which is a Hebrew acronym for a security organization. I think it was the Scientific Bureau or something that it stood for. These people were charged with espionage around the world, mainly centered in the United States, to steal materials, components, and information about nuclear weapons production capabilities. They were also the people that befuddled the inspectors sent by President Kennedy and for a time by President Johnson to look into Dimona to try to confirm the Israeli claims that it was a research reactor, not a weapons production reactor. There's a Ministry of Defense organization called Raphael, another Hebrew acronym that you'll see show up in the chronology as I go through it. Just to give you a time reference, historians believe today, scholars believe today, that the first Israeli nuclear weapons were available for use at the time of the Six-Day War in 1967, to try to give you a time reference. This next slide is a quick picture of Dimona. It's hard to see much on that slide. I just point out that on the right-hand side is the usual reactor containment dome that you're used to seeing at other nuclear plants. I think in the middle there are cooling towers, forced draft cooling towers, and then the tower on the far left would be for gaseous effluents from the plant. An important thing to remember, these plants all have radioactive effluents. So the company that was involved in the diversion of materials to Israel was a company called NUMEC, Nuclear Materials and Equipment Corporation. And the next couple slides provide a timeline for NUMEC's operation. It's left something off of the start. In 1955, there was a Geneva Conference on Peaceful Uses of Atomic Energy, where people from developing nations that hadn't been involved in the Manhattan Project and the bomb production capability of the United States in World War II first came together to talk about, under the Atoms for Peace kind of dialogue, what they wanted to do with nuclear energy. And Israel was prime attendee at that meeting in the person of Ernst David Bergman, who went on to become the father of the Israeli atomic bomb. He was the chairman at that time of the Israeli Atomic Energy Commission. And Bergman turned out to be a close colleague of a man named Zalman Shapiro. Shapiro is an American Jew from the Pittsburgh area who was a world-famous nuclear metallurgist. He knew a lot about uranium, he knew a lot about plutonium, he knew a lot about how to clad fuel elements, how to make fuel elements for reactors, and he learned those things in the United States Nuclear Navy program. He designed the first nuclear submarine for the United States, the Nautilus. His neighbor in the Pittsburgh area was a man named David Lowenthal. Lowenthal was a hero, really, of the 48 war, the War of Independence in Israel. He was on the Exodus, the ship the Exodus, taking refugees to Israel after World War II. He was a confidant of Ben-Gurion. He organized the funding for the company called NUMEC. Zalman Shapiro became the president of NUMEC. He left U.S. government employment at Bettis Atomic Power Laboratory and started the company NUMEC. It started processing highly enriched uranium for the U.S. Navy in 1960. By 1964, the Oak Ridge National Laboratory people were learning that there was missing uranium, what they call inventory differences or material unaccounted for, at the NUMEC facility in Apollo, Pennsylvania. The Oak Ridge people, remember Oak Ridge is the first uranium enrichment capability in the world built during World War II. Oak Ridge alerted the Atomic Energy Commission, then under the leadership of Dr. Glenn Seaborg, Nobel laureate for the discovery of plutonium. The AEC did an independent audit, used the best people they could find, the best people from Oak Ridge, best people from the Commission, best people from NUMEC, and they came up with 178 kilograms of missing highly enriched uranium. Of that 178, they found that 94 kilograms could no way be accounted for. Over the next year or so, NUMEC borrowed $2.2 million to pay for the 178. They had to pay for it all, whether it went up in the air or whether it went someplace that nobody knew about. In 1967, being in dire financial straits, NUMEC sold to Atlantic Richfield Company, an interesting sale that Grant wrote about in an earlier book that coincided with Atlantic Richfield Company's first entry into the nuclear business. It got a $30 million a year contract at the Hanford Works in the state of Washington, sort of coincidentally with its purchase of NUMEC. Some people can't visualize how this NUMEC facility in Apollo, was it a great big thing or a little bitty thing? Here's a kind of scale. It's about 2 stories tall. It's about 1.5 blocks long. That's the factory in the top photo, and the bottom photo is the office building across the street, which figures in the story. So the inventory difference grew to 287 kilograms. For those of you who think in terms of pounds, that's about 600 pounds of missing highly enriched uranium. Think 10 to 20 pounds to make an atom bomb. Then in 1968, something that's on the cover of my book, and we'll see here in a minute, is records of 4 senior espionage officials, espionage agents of the government of Israel, visited NUMEC under false credentials. In 1970, Shapiro left NUMEC, went to work for a company called Kawecki Barilko, which made beryllium components for nuclear weapons, supplied the beryllium, which is used in a variety of ways in nuclear weapons. He applied for a higher security clearance than the one he had. He got involved with the Nixon administration and Attorney General Mitchell. Some of you will remember John Mitchell. And Mitchell said, no, don't give him a security clearance. It was after the Oppenheimer trial where Oppenheimer lost his security clearance. Seaborg didn't want to go through that again. With Shapiro, they fought back and forth between the AEC and the Justice Department, and in the end, AEC found him a job where he didn't need a security clearance, and it paid $10,000 a year more than what he was making, and he took that job at Westinghouse, where he spent most of the rest of his career. In 1971, Babcock and Wilcox Company, that's the people who designed 3 Mile Island, by the way, bought NUMEC from Atlantic Richfield Company. They stopped operations in '78. The plant was decommissioned, returned to a green field by 1992, but it had a waste disposal site a few miles away that is now the subject of a Superfund cleanup by the United States government to the tune of $400 million, organized by the Corps of Engineers, and the costs are being negotiated by the Justice Department. Okay, that's the story of NUMEC. Go back to the audit in 1965, the 178 kilograms that was missing, 94 kilograms unexplained. The NRC historian has recorded that as 6 atomic bombs, maybe a little more. There was no FBI investigation of the theft, the alleged diversion, in 1965 or 66. The AEC, under Dr. Seaborg, said that they didn't think it had been stolen. They didn't know where it went for sure, but it didn't think it had been stolen. If you look at the records of their discussions, the commission discussions with their staff, there's no discussion whatsoever of Dr. Shapiro's association with Israel. There was a suspicion, but they didn't talk in any detail about those associations. I'll give you some of that detail in a minute. They had various explanations for where the material went. None of it panned out. They dug up things in waste disposal. They counted filters at Oak Ridge Laboratory. They couldn't find, 94 kilograms. That's 200 pounds of highly enriched uranium. Later, Seaborg wrote a number of books, and he wrote 3 of them that were memoirs where he discussed NUMEC. And in one of them, he said, what good would it do to admit that HEU had been stolen and given to Israel? He denied that it happened, but he said, what good would it do? So Dr. Shapiro was a Zionist. He was a national officer in the Zionist Organization of America. He was an awardee of the ZOA. He told both the FBI and the AEC when they had hearings with him that he wanted to immigrate to Israel. Finally, in a wiretap, the FBI picked up his admission that the Israelis told him he was more valuable to them here than he was there. You can read down this slide. You can see it on the web later. He was associated with Bergman, the founder of the father of the Israeli bomb, a number of LACM agents, people from Mossad. We're going to talk about Rafi Eitan in a minute, and those are some of his associations. One of the keys to understanding how this happened was that the CIA, beginning in 1966, 67, 68, thought Israel had the bomb, but they hadn't confirmed that Dimona was producing plutonium. And so they charged the CIA station chief, John Haddon, and his people in Tel Aviv to make trips to Dimona and collect samples in the environment. Remember the gaseous effluents. At any nuclear plant, you can pick up very small traces of radioactivity. That's why they're so closely regulated, to keep those traces very small. So they were looking for plutonium in the environment, and John Haddon's son remembers going out there with his dad on peanut butter sandwich trips, where the kids would eat the peanut butter sandwich and the father would collect flora in the vicinity, throw it in the trunk, and head back to Tel Aviv. We don't know today who counted those, did the radioactive analysis of those samples, but they found highly enriched uranium before they found plutonium, and there was no highly enriched uranium at Dimona. Israel had no capability to enrich uranium. What we know today is that they were able to put a signature on that highly enriched uranium that proved that it came from the United States, that it came from the Naval Nuclear Program, because the fuel for Navy reactors was 97.7% enriched. A little science: natural uranium, 0.7%. Uranium in a light water reactor, power reactor like we use, 3%. Uranium in a nuclear weapon, typically 93%, depending on the country. But the naval fuel was 97.7, and that's what Haddon found in the environment near Dimona, the type of fuel processed by NUMEC. This is what's on the cover of the book. In 1968, these 4 Israeli spies showed up at NUMEC, and just briefly, Avraham Hermoni was the LACM chief in the United States. He recruited a number of spies for Israel in the nuclear program. He went back to Raphael, where he was a deputy director of that weapons effort in Israel. Ephraim Bigun was sort of the technician of Shin Bet, the Israeli FBI. Abraham Bender went on to be the head of Shin Bet. Rafael Eitan went on to be the head of LACM and recruited and ran Jonathan Pollard in the United States. They visited NUMEC in 1968, and there were various stories they created. In the book, you'll read my assessment that what they were really there for was to enlist Shapiro's help with the fabrication of fuel for Dimona using uranium they stole from the Western Europeans. I'm going to skip the next couple slides. And there's an eyewitness account of the theft that's discussed in the book that the FBI did not follow up on, and we today don't know why. And then I'm going to talk about what various people concluded, and Grant, please bear with me and I'll be done. J. Edgar Hoover said remove his clearance, take away all of his contracts. 4 attorneys general touched it: Ramsey Clark, John Mitchell, Edward Levy, and Griffin Bell. They said don't give him any more clearances. They did wiretaps. They said more was needed, and then by 1980 the whole thing ended. Seaborg said what good did it do to admit. Morris Udall said that if he had to write in an envelope whether it happened or not, having finished his investigation, and the penalty for being wrong was death, he would write in his envelope that it happened. other politicians have been slow to say. Richard Helms said we did the job and avoided political risk. God knows what Richard Helms meant in his, in his biography. Zbigniew Brzezinski, just last year, when presented with documents that Grant found, said, well, something did transpire. It's explosive. It's controversial. What do you want me to do? Ask him to give it back? So enough from me. There are lots of implications of this business of a policy nature. My conclusion is the material went there. Whether Shapiro was actually present when it happened, it's hard to prove. They tell me about arson. If you don't see the match held to the flame, it's hard to make an arson conviction. I think the Justice Department had the same trouble here. And finally, I would say that NUMEC's not alone, that Lackham and Raphael Eitan, who's still alive, by the way, recruited Arnon Milchan, the famous Hollywood producer. Most recent movie was Revenant. He did Gone Girl, Birdman. He's one of the wealthiest men in the world, was an Israeli spy causing the smuggling of materials and information to their nuclear program for many years. And last but not least, on a deeper understanding level, the Israel lobby impedes frank discussion of Israel on this subject. This book has stuff in that people haven't seen before, and I hope they'll pay attention to it. The Israeli policy of nuclear opacity, denying that they have the bomb when we all know they do, impedes frank discussion of weapons-free Middle East, which the Obama administration and others have talked about, and we ought to get on with. The only solution to these nuclear weapons things is nuclear disarmament. It's probably a 100-year process. We ought to start today. Thank you.
We've encouraged all of our speakers to stay, and we're certainly probably not going to be able to get to all of your questions on NUMEC or Congress and the making of Middle East policy, but please seek them out during breaks, during the book signings, during other opportunities. Our next speaker, Kirk James Beattie, is the author of Congress and the Shaping of the Middle East, as well as 2 books on Egyptian politics, Egypt during the Nasser years and Egypt during the Sadat years. Professor Beattie is at Simmons College in the Political Science and International Relations Department, specializing in comparative politics with regional expertise in Middle East and West European politics. He's taught at Harvard, Wellesley, the Fletcher School of Law and Diplomacy, and the University of Michigan. He's a recipient of numerous national scholarships, including a Fulbright grant, a Fulbright-Hays grant, and an International Rotary Foundation Fellowship, an American Research Center in Egypt grant, and a Center for Arabic Study Abroad Fellowship.
Thank you very much. I'd like to thank the people at IRMEP and the Washington Report for inviting me here. I've benefited tremendously from their work over the years and from the ability to interview some of them for actually the book that I completed not long ago. I am, by formal training, a Middle East specialist, and as Grant just said, my first 2 books were ones that related to Egypt. My children are at a certain age where I didn't think it made much sense to be taking them out of the country again, ripping them out of the school system here, to maybe a more dubious educational possibility in Egypt. And so I decided to follow up on an idea that I'd had for a number of years, which was to come down to D.C., make numerous trips here, to look into a subject that had been on my mind for a long time, and that was one that dealt with the role that Congress plays in the shaping of Middle East policy. A lot of people have argued that Congress doesn't have much of a role in this issue area, so I'll come back to later on, but I thought that this could make for an interesting topic and one that had not been written on very extensively at all. like to use as my primary method of analysis one of doing elite interviewing. And so for my first two books, I interviewed very extensively people in the broad Egyptian political elite. I wanted to do the same thing here because I think that by talking to people who are involved in playing the political game themselves, that gives you, as an outsider, myself being the outsider, the best possible view of how the insiders are behaving, what motivates them to, take their decisions in the way that they do. I also knew that probably the people who were actually serving as members of Congress were people that might have a more difficult time talking very frankly about these matters because they're still in the hot seat, so to speak. But that if I approached staffers and gave them, of course, the promise of anonymity, that they might be able to, if they assented to my request, speak much more openly and frankly about these issues, not only telling me, of course, how they went about doing their own jobs, but also how they perceived their bosses behaving. So this is what I did, and I came down and I generated a random sample for members of the House. In other words, I put 435, 0 to 435 in the computer hopper, so to speak, and randomly generated numbers that I associated with the names of each of the members of Congress. And then I just started to work my way down that list so that I would have as close to a random sample of members of the House as I possibly could. I went into all 100 Senate offices requesting interviews. Typically, whether it was on the House side or on the Senate side, I would walk in. You're naked in Washington, D.C. if you don't have your ID, your card, right, your business card. So I'd pull out a business card and present myself, tell them why I was there. I was hoping to speak with the person who had the foreign policy portfolio for whomever the boss was in that particular office. And that I would like to, speak with them for the purpose of doing a book on, again, the role that Congress played in shaping Middle East policy. So I, in the end, ended up with somewhere on the order of at least one interview with 130 or more House members, and then later on I went back. My initial wave of interviews was in the 2005-2006 period. I came back down here, made numerous trips again between 2011 and 2013 to follow up with additional interviews, typically on the second round, talking to as many people as I had met the first time around. And on the House side, I talked to about 130 people initially, and then had follow-up interviews with a number of them. On the Senate side, I had interviews with over 30 Senate staffers total, which I think were reasonably decent representative numbers across the board. So this book that I've written is one that's very heavily based on my interviews with the staffers, and I tried to begin just by getting an idea of who they were. These are people that play an incredibly important role for their bosses, for the members of Congress. The members of Congress would be incapable of moving on all kinds of issues in any way, resembling an intelligent fashion if they didn't have the assistance of these staffers. So I was very curious as to who the staffers themselves were. Where were they coming from? How did they get the job? How were they recruited? What kind of where had they studied? Where had they done their university studies? Had they gone to graduate school or not at all? Were they political scientists? Were they people that had studied, in other disciplines? Were they people that had ever taken a course on Middle East politics and so forth? So I spent quite a bit of time trying to get to know the staffers reasonably well at the beginning of my interview, asking them how old they were, how long they'd been up on the Hill, and so on and so forth. And so I think I came up with a reasonably good sense of who the people were. And then, of course, the bigger issue was to try to figure out how they went about doing their work, and how they went about advising their bosses, and what kind of communications they had then with their bosses, and ultimately how their bosses thought about issues in this issue area and arrived at their own decisions. Now, I have not worked on the Hill. I had not worked on the Hill ever. I still have not ever worked on the Hill in terms of being in some sort of a staffing capacity at all. So this was new to me. I'm not an Americanist by my formal training. I'm a person that studied Middle East politics and so forth. And so I walked into these offices, and when I started sitting down with the first people with whom I was conducting these interviews, I would say, okay, well, you're the person who has the foreign policy portfolio for Representative X. Is this all that you do? So I know that there must be some people in this room that know the answer to this question and maybe know this a lot better than I do. But I was stunned because they would say, well, yes, I do foreign policy. I also do defense. I do intelligence. I do homeland security. I do veterans affairs. I do taxation. I do the environment. I do immigration issues. Now, I think I may be up to about 8 or 9 enormous portfolios at this point, but usually they went up to about 12 to 14 different portfolios. This is on the House side. How can any human being possibly be knowledgeable and have expertise in this many different issue areas? It's just humanly impossible. And these are the individuals that are providing the information to their bosses across this range of issues, and upon whom the bosses are depending to a considerable extent. The modal age for my House interviewees was 23. So they're directly out of school. I talk to my students at school now, and I say to them, look, you're just a couple of years removed from being highly qualified to go on and be working in a House office. On the Senate side of the picture, it was different in that you had maybe half as many portfolios, or possibly slightly fewer in some cases, that were being carried by these Senate staffers. And the modal age did go up to 36 in that case. So there's a significant disparity across the two sides of the Hill, yet the House plays its role and the people on the Senate side play their own role. By the way, there isn't a lot of communication across the board between the two, if you weren't aware of that. But I was blown away again then by the hard work, of course, that was being put in by the staffers on both sides, including on the House side, but the lack of expertise, the lack of knowledge by maybe the youthful exuberance that they brought to their jobs, but by the lack of deeper knowledge. And so I would have people who had been around there for 3 or 4 years, whom I came to consider more as being like veterans, right, if they'd been working on the Hill for 3 to 4 years. And they would look at me and say, so you've come here to find out how little we know in this issue area, right? This is kind of a standard thing that I came up with. Now, I didn't go in with the intention of focusing on AIPAC. I've been sort of asked to if I would focus a bit more on AIPAC for the purpose of this presentation. I'm very happy to do so. I will note, though, that of all the different organizations, lobbyists and so forth that were mentioned to me, and there was not a very long list of organizations that was mentioned to me by the staffers, the only one that came up consistently by every single staffer was that of AIPAC. Every single staffer, even if they'd been there for a very short amount of time, was familiar with AIPAC. They'd been made aware of its existence from very early on because people from AIPAC, highly professional, very, very quick to move in and to introduce themselves and make themselves known and to offer their assistance to people in office and knowing that maybe there's a brand new person on the job in a particular office. So AIPAC, I came to learn from others, was described in very positive terms by many, many people, but also as kind of the 800-pound gorilla by others, by a number of other people. I looked that up. There really aren't 800-pound gorillas. The biggest gorillas only get to be 600 pounds or so. So if you want to take away anything of interest from this talk, at least you have that going for you. Now, how does AIPAC go about then currying its influence? I'm narrowing the focus a bit now. It begins with elections, and it begins very, very early. In fact, it begins before people are even running for Congress per se. AIPAC invests a lot of efforts, perhaps with the assistance. I need to talk to Grant Sullivan, had an opportunity with the JCRC groups that he was talking about earlier on at the community level, in scouting individuals, looking for rising stars on either side of the political aisle to try to see whether somebody who's running for a municipal council in a major city or for some lower level job looks like he or she has the potential to rise up to be quite a bright, promising or is showing themselves as a bright, promising political candidate who might, over the longer run, then be somebody who is interested in running for a congressional office. And so from very on, the vetting process begins. even before people are running for Congress. And also opportunities are extended, and this I think is going to be spoken about later on by Gideon Levy, if I'm not mistaken, in his keynote speech. So I'm not going to go into this in any greater detail now, but opportunities are provided such as trips to Israel. So the attempt to socialize people who are perceived even as potential candidates for running for Congress begins at a very early age from the perspective of some of these groups, including that of AIPAC. In addition, of course, money plays an exceptionally important role. I had one young Jewish American staffer who said to me in a very friendly way, he's trying to forewarn me, now whatever you do, don't talk about the money. I know that he was afraid that if I started talking about the money at any point or mentioned this in the book, that would open me up all the more to accusations of anti-Semitism and so forth, because it's a standard trope, right? And so I thanked him for having done that, but how does one ignore the money when the Congress persons, if I can use that term, themselves spend the bulk of their time looking for money? I mean, they only arrive, some of them here, as Representative David Obey, longtime veteran on the House side, told me here maybe on Tuesday morning or something like that, work Tuesday through Thursday, and then they're on a plane by late Thursday or Friday morning back to their home constituencies to raise money again, and they're raising money while they're in their offices here as well. So money is exceptionally important to all these individuals, as you all well know. And AIPAC, as a 501c4 organization, cannot provide direct assistance this way, but they do then arrange for large meetings with people that are coming from the particular, usually on a regional basis. And then at these regional meetings, which are fundraising activities for AIPAC, they'll put people who are congressional candidates in touch with donors at those particular organizations. So this is the way that the AIPAC tends to work these things out. The relative absence of significant countervailing influences here is important, because the first thing that people over the years have thought about in terms of a countervailing influence to I like to say more pro-right-wing Israeli government actors is the oil lobby. So I would listen to my, again, interviewees talk about individuals that they were being contacted by and who had influence in whatever shape and manner and so forth. And they would actually, again, to a person, not talk at all about the oil lobby. So finally, at the end of this segment of the interview, I would say, well, but what about the oil lobby? And they would sit back, and they would these are even people coming from oil-producing states, and they would scratch their heads, and they'd say, no, we never hear from people from the oil lobby at all on things relating to this issue, which I found very, very interesting. So once the people are elected and they arrive on the Hill, how does AIPAC try to sustain its influence? Well, numerous measures. First of all, they are very active in providing members of Congress with letters, with the Dear Colleague letters, and with the provision of materials that set bills in action. So this is one important factor. I'm going to have to skip through maybe some of these things along the way because I see the clock is ticking down on me at a ferocious pace. They keep scorecards on the way that people vote. They very heavily use and intelligently have recourse to their own constituents. And so people in these offices are much more likely to want to listen to and hear from their own constituents and will respond to constituent concerns than they are to listen to people that are coming from the outside. But the staffers, again, know of AIPAC's significance and so forth, and so AIPAC can get its foot in the door in a way that a lot of other actors or interest groups and lobbyists are not allowed to do so. They go to great length then to keep score of how people are voting. They communicate that information back to their constituents. Constituents call on a regular basis so that they become people that have first name basis contact with the person that holds the foreign policy portfolio, like Kevin's on the line from Cincinnati or whatever, would you take it? And they'll take the call and they'll talk to people that way. Again, this is not a game that is being played with anywhere near the same success by any of the other lobbyists compared to AIPAC. Another thing, again, and this is what's structural in nature about the way that AIPAC succeeds, is that they know exactly how strapped these staffers are in terms of the time that they have allotted to deal with any particular issues. And so for AIPAC to come along and basically deliver talking points and information to them on a silver platter makes life so much easier for them that they're very happy to be on the receiving end of that information. Yet another point that's somewhere up there, I'm probably wandering at this point in terms of I can't really kind of read these things very well without putting my glasses on. So anyway, is that many of the staffers, of course, only last on these jobs for a very short number of years. They're only there for 1 or 2 or 3 years, right? They're not being very well paid, and so they know that if they can get a job with lobbyists for any lobbying firm, then after they've been on the job for, again, a short number of years and have acquired that experience, they can leave the Hill, go to work for a lobbyist, and they can start making 3 times as much money as they were, at least 3 times as much money as they were being paid as a staffer. Now, I want you to think about that a little bit longer, because if your longer run objective then is one of being hired by a lobbyist, I'm now broadening the focus to think about, the implications for the influence of other special interest groups, then how likely are you to be biting the hand of people that are trying to provide you information for free if you might want to go be employed by those people over the longer run? So all these kinds of factors, come into consideration. Another thing that's going on then is the one of the foxes being placed in charge of the chicken coop, so to speak. And so if you have the time, look very carefully to see which individuals have served over time as the chairs or the ranking members and so forth of the committee and subcommittee in foreign policy and appropriations. And what you'll tend to find in this issue area that we're discussing here are people who are coming from what one more conservative or right-wing staffer described to me as dark blue as opposed to light blue, meaning in terms of their commitment to Israel kind of backgrounds. And you'll tend to see people who are coming from, very hardcore, dark blue Jewish American districts in the country, or people that are coming from evangelical backgrounds, or people that are security hawks. And so they tend to be clustered in these committees and subcommittees of foreign policy and appropriations in a way that's very important. Now, let me just try to wrap things up here. Is Congress's role important? You've had a lot of people along the way who have argued that this is not the case. Aaron David Miller has written about this fairly extensively. I imagine a lot of people in the room have heard of him. People on the left, like Noam Chomsky, have written about this, that the lobby doesn't play a very important role. I beg to disagree. The president has tremendous power, of course, but it's the Congress, again, over time that does things like sign the bills that provide the $3.2 billion annually, and now maybe going up to $5 billion annually in terms of assistance to Israel. And so I like to think of this in terms of maybe a horse trainer who can butte up, sort of drug a horse so that it performs more marvelously in a race, but that is potentially injurious over the longer run to the health of the horse, so to speak. And let me just finish then by saying that I think the question is posed: is AIPAC's influence then bad for America? And what I learned along the way from the staffers, and really so much of the book is based, again, on the hundreds of interviews that I did with the staffers, is that you have people who are even Jewish American staffers who are embarrassed by the power of AIPAC. You have many, many other staffers, including Jewish American staffers, who are disgusted by the power of AIPAC. In over 30 years of teaching on this subject, not once ever have I in the classroom ever accused any of the members of Congress or any of the actors in the executive branch of having dual loyalties or of being treasonous. And yet I can tell you that I had interviews with people who are coming from both Republican and Democrat backgrounds who told me, again, anonymously, and deferred when I asked them to give me specific names, things like insert the name of any other country into the formula, and any member of Congress for their behavior would be accused of treason. So I'll conclude on that note. Thank you.
We've got a hard stop at 10:20. Just to note that Dr. Mattson will be signing his book at the conclusion of this panel over in the exhibition hall. We've got a number of questions which we're still receiving by internet, by Twitter, of course, from our wonderful participants. One of them asked immediately after seeing some of my slides on polling, how many Americans believe that Israel has multiple nuclear weapons? We polled that in 2014. It was the majority of Americans. So people know how that figures into the qualitative military edge we're supposed to pay for as taxpayers is never discussed. So that's an open question. Paul Thomas from Chicago via email asks, how do you view presidential candidates on their Middle East policy positions? That'll be covered by Justin Raimondo of antiwar.com during his presentation, so stay tuned. L. Michael Hager from Easton, Massachusetts is asking, why do so many states pass resolutions opposing boycotts, divestments, and sanctions? It's the same organizations, it's the same legislative templates that we see in state after state. So a lot of the organizations, JCRC's local mini APACs, such as exist in the California Policy Committee, are active in passing those. Now, whether or not they're constitutional should be decided fairly soon. Is the information given by me today available in the book? Some of it. The rest of the slides will be on the israelsinfluence.org website. And now I'd like to just pass it on to Roger Mattson for his questions.
I had a couple people, is that on? Yeah, I had a couple of people ask about the connection between Israel and the South Africans. There was cooperation on nuclear weapons under apartheid regime. The Israelis promised not to be the first to introduce nuclear weapons in the Middle East. That was a deal they cut with several presidents of the United States. But they parsed that over time by assembling weapons at the Six-Day War and by conducting the tests that they conducted of what were thought to be at least one neutron bomb in the Indian Ocean with the cooperation of the South Africans. I think what they got in return was some uranium ore. It's in the book briefly, but that's another whole subject about which a couple books have been written. What was the role of Shimon Peres and France in building Dimona? Well, Shimon Peres made the deal with the French nuclear authorities. Some say with and some say without de Gaulle's knowledge. And then Shimon Peres was the man to whom Ernst David Bergman reported as the chairman of the Israeli Atomic Energy Commission. So the triumvirate that built the Israeli bomb was Ben-Gurion, Peres, and Bergman, and then minions. Then a question about what is the current status of U.S. officials, including the president, refusing to acknowledge that Israel has nuclear weapons. That deal is nuclear ambiguity or nuclear opacity, the policy of Israel on nuclear weapons. It was a deal that was made in private by President Nixon and Golda Meir. Even Henry Kissinger was forbidden to be in the room. It was never written down, but the understanding is don't ask, don't tell. We won't talk about it. We'll quit sending inspectors, and we won't acknowledge that you have the bomb. It's now a silly policy. It ought to be undone, but it's not undone by either side.
Yes, so my question is there any significant lobbying in Congress for the Palestinians? Excellent question. I again would give free rein to the interviewees to respond to my questions on the Hill, however they chose to do so. Typically, they would talk a lot about AIPAC, maybe talk about being visited by some other organizations. But they tended to be pretty vague in terms of organizations. I'm making a generalization now. So across the board, people tended to be much more vague about organizations that would weigh in on behalf of the Palestinians or different Arab interests. And so you would have some people say, well, there was this group of church women that were in here the other day that were talking about. They wouldn't necessarily be able, they're probably thinking about Churches for Middle East Peace, but they wouldn't necessarily be able to remember the name of the organization. Now let me, though, say this. This is not it's not a pro-Israel sort of pro-Palestinian or pro-Israel, pro-Arab issue in my mind, and I don't think it's that's the way that it should be perceived by other people as well. For the following reason, this is a pro-peace or pro-successful resolution of the conflict, of the Israel-Palestine conflict issue. At the end of the day, what does that mean? That means that you have very, very interesting and important activity by predominantly, overwhelmingly even in many cases, Jewish American organizations that are collecting data, that are presenting the data people, that are trying to push the peace envelope, if one takes, and I do, at face value what it is they're doing. And so if you look at an organization like Americans for Peace Now, if you look at an organization like Israel Policy Forum, there are two examples there in D.C. that are known to most of the players on the Hill that are playing the game that way. Other groups that are important, too, are not necessarily ones that come with some sort of Arab name attached to them. Does the Arab American Institute play a role? Yes. Does the ADC, play a role? Yes, they weigh in from time to time, but they're less likely to be really active on the Hill than are a lot of these other groups are. They don't have the same resources that AIPAC does to begin with. Their resources are dwarfed by those of AIPAC, as are the resources that are held by Americans for Peace Now and the Israel Policy Forum and so forth. So what are some of these other groups that weigh in, and I think are doing so with somewhat greater success? One that comes to mind to me, in terms of my experience, again, were the Quakers and FCNL. So the Friends Committee on National Legislation has, again, a small number of people that are dedicated to lobbying in this issue area on behalf of peace, right? And so they have made themselves known. Another very tiny group that probably a lot of the people in the room have not heard of before, I don't even know because I've been out of the country a lot the last 2 years, but a little tiny group is called Telos. And so you have people that are coming from evangelical backgrounds who have organized themselves. They're very knowledgeable people. They organize trips to take people to the region where they have them meet people on the Palestinian side as well as on the Israeli side of the picture. And they're doing a very good job of trying to push the peace envelope themselves. So it's quite a mixed bag.
Okay, we've got a hard stop in about 2 minutes. Did you want to go on, Professor Beatty, on that?
Yeah, I'd be happy to. There's the question's another very interesting one. Would you encourage other organizations and concerned citizens to use AIPAC strategies and tactics against AIPAC itself? Who can argue with their success? I mean, Larry King, I did a thing with Larry King's Blob, and he asked me, does the lobby own Congress and so forth? And I said, well, own no, But I thought later on it would have been more clever if I had responded by saying, hey, pardon the baseball analogy, but if you could bat 800, you'd be quite happy to be batting 800, or if you could have a sort of percentage of winning 9 out of 10 times or 8 out of 10 times, then who wouldn't think that was a job very well done? So yes, I think there's a lot of merit potentially in copying the AIPAC model, and I'll stop there to leave room for another response.
Great. I think we're going to move on. Thank you, everyone who sent questions from the internet stream and locally here. And again, please pursue these speakers with your questions. Dr. Mattson will be signing his book directly after this panel. Gideon Levy will be signing at 11. At 12:40, Professor Beatty will be signing his book in the exhibition hall. Susan Abu Hawa at 3, Rula Jibril at 5, and I'll be doing it at 5:30. So thank you very much, Panel 1 is over.
Everyone, we're going to run a tight schedule, so we're going to keep going with our first keynote speaker. So if everyone can just sit down, please. Yeah, fast side.
All right, we're going to continue to keep the program on track here. Our next speaker is about to be announced. For those of you who could not find a seat, we do have both balconies open. And so if you're standing in the back and want a chair, we're going to offer that to you. And we will have more seating after lunch when the East Room is opened up. So please be seated and we'll proceed. There is a break coming up in a bit.
That's correct, right? Then we just need the name tags. You need a name. Yeah, it's right there. And then I'm just going to sit up here too, so mine.